My brother stood up in that courtroom, pointed directly at me, and told the judge I was a danger to myself and everyone around me. He said I had a history of instability. He said our father had been confused and manipulated in his final months. He said I was the last person on earth who should inherit anything from anyone. I sat with my hands folded on the table and did not say a single word. Judge Raymond Calloway, a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of patience that only comes from 30 years on the bench, let my brother finish. Then he looked at my brother's attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Christine Poole, who I had seen in this exact courtroom before, though she had not seen me. Then he looked at me. I watched the moment he recognized me. A slight pause, a small shift in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like the quiet satisfaction of a man who already knows how the story ends. He did not say anything yet. But I knew. Let me tell you how I ended up in room 214 of the Hennepin County Government Center on a Tuesday morning in February. My name is Mia Callahan. I am 32 years old and I work as a senior forensic auditor for a firm called Whitmore Consulting in Minneapolis. We contract primarily with insurance companies, financial institutions, and occasionally law enforcement. My job is to find fraud, not the obvious kind, not the person who submits a fake receipt for a stolen bicycle. I find the sophisticated kind, the kind where someone has spent months building a paper facade that looks completely legitimate until you know exactly where to look. I have reviewed over 400 cases in 6 years. I have testified as an expert witness in 41 of them. 28 of those testimonies happened in Hennepin County District Court. 7 of those 28 happened in Judge Calloway's courtroom. My brother did not know any of this. We had not spoken in 4 years. Here is what you need to understand about my brother, Derek. When I was 20 years old, I went through what my family has always politely called a difficult period. My mother had died the year before from ovarian cancer. I was a sophomore at the University of Minnesota, 300 miles from home, sitting in an empty dorm room in November, trying to understand how the world could just keep moving when the most important person in it was gone. I started drinking, more than I should have, more than anyone should. I missed classes. I missed exams. I got a DUI on a Thursday night in March that I genuinely do not remember in any detail except the look on the officer's face when he shone his flashlight into my car. I spent 3 months in an outpatient program. I rebuilt. I got sober. I transferred schools, finished my degree in accounting and statistics, found my way into forensic work almost by accident when a professor asked me to help him review financial documents for a case he was consulting on, and I turned out to be very good at it. I have been sober for 11 years. My brother has been holding that DUI over my head for 11 years. Derek is 38. He lives 40 minutes outside of Minneapolis in a suburb called Eden Prairie with his wife, Rochelle, and their 2 kids. He works in commercial real estate. He drives a truck that costs more than some houses and takes 2 vacations a year. He is the kind of man who frames success as a personality trait and never quite forgave me for being the one our father talked about more. Our father, Gerald Callahan, retired mechanical engineer, Sunday crossword devotee, maker of genuinely exceptional chili, died on October 19th of last year. He was 74. He had been living with moderate Parkinson's disease for 3 years and congestive heart failure for 1. He did not go quickly, but he went peacefully in the house he had lived in for 31 years in Bloomington, with me sitting beside him holding his hand. Derek was on a flight back from Scottsdale when it happened. He did not make it in time. I do not think he has forgiven me for that either, even though I had been at my father's bedside for the better part of 3 days, and there was nothing either of us could have done differently. My father left a will. He had updated it 14 months before he died, when he was still clear-headed and fully competent, with a lawyer named Howard Prentice, who had handled his documents for 20 years. The will left the house, valued at approximately $340,000, his savings account with just over $190,000, and his personal property to me. He left Derek $20,000, specifically designated for the grandchildren's education funds. Derek filed a petition to contest the will 11 days after the funeral. According to his petition, our father had been suffering from significant cognitive decline in his final year. According to his petition, I had isolated my father from family, controlled his access to communication, and manipulated a vulnerable elderly man into changing his estate plans to benefit myself. He claimed my father had not been mentally competent to execute a valid will. He claimed the will should be invalidated. His evidence was my DUI from 11 years ago, a psychiatric evaluation note from a counselor I had seen for 8 sessions after my mother died, which somehow Derek had obtained and which described me as struggling with impulsive behavior and poor judgment, and a sworn statement from Rochelle, his wife, who had visited my father exactly twice in the past 3 years, saying that she had noticed changes in his behavior that concerned her. I read the petition on a Wednesday afternoon sitting at my desk at Whitmore Consulting. I read it twice. Then I sat very still for a long moment. I was not scared. I want to be clear about that. I was not scared because what Derek had described in those documents was not my father. The man he described, confused and isolated and manipulated, bore no resemblance to Gerald Callahan, who had called me every Sunday morning until 5 weeks before he died, who had completed the New York Times crossword in pen until about 8 months before the end, who had asked me with complete clarity and zero ambiguity to help him update his will because he had made a decision and he wanted it documented correctly. What I was, sitting at that desk, was deeply tired. Because I recognized what this was. I look at fraud for a living. I know what it looks like when someone constructs a narrative out of technically real facts arranged to imply something completely false. My brother had taken the worst year of my life, a year I had spent over a decade rebuilding from, and turned it into a legal weapon. I called my attorney, a woman named Sandra Voss, who I had worked with on a consulting basis before and who I trusted completely. I told her what was happening. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Tell me everything, and do not leave anything out." I told her everything. My father had 2 full-time home health aides in his last year. Both were certified, both were employed through a licensed agency, and both had been present at nearly every significant interaction he had with anyone outside of immediate family. I had their contact information. I had their documentation. I had my father's medical records, which showed his cognitive assessments clearly, including a neuropsychological evaluation done 8 months before he died that found no evidence of dementia and characterized his Parkinson's-related cognitive symptoms as mild and non-disabling. Sandra said she could work with that. She asked me if there was anything else I could think of. There was one thing. My father had been the kind of man who documented, not the way my work requires documentation, with spreadsheets and cross-references, but in his own way. He kept a daily log in a green composition notebook, not a diary exactly, more like a captain's log. He had been doing it since 1989. He logged the weather. He logged what he ate. He logged phone calls and visits and decisions. He logged things that bothered him. I drove to Bloomington that weekend and went through the house. I found 17 composition notebooks in a box in the back of his closet, each one labeled by year. I found the most recent one, the one covering the last 14 months of his life, in the drawer of his bedside table. I sat on the edge of his bed and read the whole thing. My father had known Derek was going to do this. Not with certainty, not as a specific prediction, but with the quiet resignation of a man who had spent 38 years watching his older son and knew exactly what he was capable of when money was involved. He had written about it in November, about 3 months before he updated his will. He wrote that Derek had called asking about the house, about what his plans were, about whether he had thought about who would manage things when he was gone. He wrote that Derek mentioned several times that I had a history of instability, the way you drop a stone into still water and watch the ripples to see what happens. He wrote that he told Derek he was not worried about Mia. He wrote that Mia knows how to handle herself. He had written my name, present tense, no confusion, no decline. He had also written something on the last page of the notebook that he had to have known I would find. It was addressed to me directly, 3 paragraphs in his careful, slightly shaky handwriting, the letters a little larger than they used to be because of the tremor. He wrote that he was sorry he had never been particularly good at saying things out loud. He wrote that he had talked to Howard Prentice and that Howard had everything in order and that I should not be afraid. He wrote that he knew I would handle whatever happened with the same steadiness I handled everything, and that he was proud of me in a way he had not managed to say often enough. He wrote that the numbers would tell the truth. He had heard me say that once, apparently, at dinner a few years ago when I was explaining my work to him, and it had stayed with him. The numbers will tell the truth when people won't. I sat on his bed for a long time. Then I went home and got to work. Derek's petition rested on 3 pillars: my history, my father's alleged decline, and the claim that I had isolated him. I needed to dismantle all 3, but I needed to do it at exactly the right moment, not before. Sandra agreed. We filed a response that was almost deliberately minimal. I was mentally competent. The will was valid. I looked forward to the hearing, nothing else. No preview of what was coming. Christine Poole requested a deposition. Of course she did. That is standard procedure, and it is also, in cases like this, an opportunity to rattle the other party, to make them feel exposed, to fish for anything useful. I had sat across from people in depositions who had stolen 7 figures from elderly clients. I had asked the questions and I had watched them squirm. I knew exactly how this worked. I answered every question in the flattest, most cooperative tone I could manage. Yes, I had a DUI at 20. Yes, I had seen a counselor briefly after my mother died. Yes, I had been the primary person managing my father's care in his last year. I did not elaborate. I did not defend. I gave her exactly what she asked for and nothing more. I watched her note-taking slow down as the deposition went on. She had expected resistance or emotion or something she could use. She got a woman who answered questions like she was filling out a tax form. Derek was watching via video link. I saw his expression shift from tense to something looser, more confident, as the deposition went on. He thought he had me. He thought I was defeated or frightened, or both. He had never watched me work. 3 weeks before the hearing, I received a call from a woman named Patricia Souza. She said she was the daughter of Edna Souza, who had been one of my father's home-up aides for nearly 8 months of the previous year. Patricia told me her mother had been following the situation, had seen that there was a legal dispute, and wanted to offer a statement. Edna was 70 herself and did not travel easily, but she was entirely willing to give a sworn statement or testify by video. I called Sandra immediately. Edna Souza had kept her own notes. Professional habit from decades of home health work. She logged every shift, every medication, every conversation of significance. She had notes on 17 visits Derek and Rochelle had made to the house in my father's final year. She had notes on what my father had said during and after those visits, because she was usually there, quietly in the background, doing her job. She noted that on 4 separate occasions, my father had asked her after Derek and Rochelle left whether she thought people ever changed or whether they just got better at pretending. She had noted his exact words each time. Those words were going to matter. Sandra also tracked down the other aide, a younger man named Marcus Webb, who had worked the morning shifts for 6 months. Marcus confirmed that Derek had called the house directly 3 times and asked to speak with my father privately, and that my father had each time asked Marcus to stay in the room. My father had known. He had not been confused or isolated or manipulated. He had been a 74-year-old man with a tremor in his hands and a clear mind, watching his older son circle his estate like a very transparent vulture, and quietly making sure that there were witnesses. I built the file the way I build every file. Timeline, cross-references, every fact verified from at least 2 independent sources. Sandra reviewed it and told me it was the most organized evidence package she had seen from a client in 20 years of practice. I told her my father had taught me well. He just did not know he was training a fraud examiner. The night before the hearing, I sat at my kitchen table with the green composition notebook open in front of me. I did not read it again. I just sat with it for a while. My partner, James, a high school science teacher with a calm and decency that I sometimes find genuinely baffling, brought me tea and did not ask me to talk about anything I did not want to talk about. He asked me once, a few weeks into all of this, whether I wanted him to say something to Derek. I told him no. I told him that the best thing he could do was be in that courtroom. I wanted him to see who I was when I was working. He said he would not miss it. February 18th, Hennepin County Government Center. I arrived early because I always arrive early. I wore a gray blazer and my father's old watch, the silver one he wore every day for 20 years, because it fit my wrist when I punched a new hole in the band and because I wanted something of his with me. The courtroom filled quietly. James sat in the back row with my colleague Dana from Whitmore, who had worked a case with me 6 months ago and driven 40 minutes in February weather to sit in that room for 2 hours. Sandra sat beside me, her briefcase closed, expression neutral. She had told me that morning to trust the evidence. Derek arrived with Rochelle. He was wearing a suit that looked like it had been bought specifically for this occasion. He walked in with the posture of a man who believes he has already won, which is a posture I have seen before in depositions, and which I have learned tells you nothing except that the person wearing it has not looked closely enough at the other side of the table. Christine Poole was already at the petitioner's table, papers organized, reading something on her phone. All rise. Judge Calloway entered. He took his seat. He put on his glasses and opened the case file. Then he looked across the room at the respondent's table. He found me immediately, and I watched the same small thing happen that I had expected. Not a smile, not recognition in the social sense. Just a brief, almost imperceptible stillness, the look of a man who has spent 30 years reading courtrooms and has just read something that recalibrated the room for him. He said nothing. He turned to the petitioner's table. Christine Poole stood and gave her opening statement. She was polished and deliberate and painted a careful picture. A concerned brother, a vulnerable father, a daughter with a documented history of instability who had inserted herself into the life of a declining elderly man and positioned herself to benefit financially. She did not rush. She let every implication land. Then she nodded to Derek, who stood and spoke. He described our father as a man who had faded in his final years, who had been dependent on me in ways that left him open to influence. He described the DUI, the counseling records, the erratic younger sister who had always needed management. His voice was steady and his face was appropriately grave. He was good at this. He had probably rehearsed. He never mentioned what I did for a living. He described me as working in accounting, which is technically accurate, the way calling a surgeon someone who works with knives is technically accurate. When he sat down, Judge Calloway looked at Christine Poole. He asked a question in a tone that was completely neutral, but which I recognized immediately. It was the tone he used when something had not added up. He said, "Counselor, what does the respondent do professionally?" Christine checked her notes. She said I was a senior accountant at a financial consulting firm in Minneapolis. The judge was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me directly for the first time and asked me to confirm my professional role for the record. Sandra touched my arm lightly to indicate she would handle it. She stood. She said we would appreciate the opportunity to clarify that for the court, and in fact our evidence package would address the respondent's background in some detail. She said she thought the court would find the context relevant. Judge Calloway nodded slowly. He said he imagined he would. Sandra opened her briefcase. She started with my professional history. 41 expert witness testimonies in 6 years. A specialization in complex financial fraud, 17 testimonies in Hennepin County District Court alone. She placed my CV and certification records in front of the clerk and handed a copy to Christine, who read the first page and went very still. Then Sandra presented my father's cognitive records, the neuropsychological evaluation, the attending physician's assessments. 8 months of documentation from both home health aides, including Edna Souza's handwritten logs, which Sandra read selections from in a clear, unhurried voice. My father asking his aide to stay in the room when Derek called. My father's words after 4 separate visits from his son, asking quietly whether people change or just get better at pretending. My father's own words, documented by a professional with no stake in the outcome, in real time, months before there was any legal dispute. I heard Rochelle exhale sharply behind the petitioner's table. I did not turn to look. Sandra placed the green composition notebook into evidence. She noted that it had been kept in my father's bedside table, that it was consistent with a 30-year habit of personal documentation, and that the relevant entries spanning 14 months showed a man who was tracking his own situation with full clarity and considerable foresight. She read 3 entries aloud, including the one from November where my father had written about Derek's questions regarding the house, and noted the way his son kept circling back to my history, and written that he was not worried about Mia. She read the last page, the one addressed to me. The courtroom was very quiet. I kept my hands folded on the table and looked straight ahead. Sandra closed by noting that the DUI cited in the petition was 11 years old, that I had completed all required treatment, maintained sobriety since, and built a career in forensic accounting that had resulted in expert testimony accepted by this court on multiple occasions. She noted that using a mental health counseling note from a 20-year-old's grief response to a mother's death as evidence of current incompetence was not only factually misleading but potentially sanctionable. She said it clearly and without drama and sat back down. Judge Calloway looked at Christine Poole. He asked if she would like to respond. Christine asked for a recess. The judge granted 10 minutes. I watched her cross the room to Derek and lean down close to his ear. I could not hear what she said, but I watched his face. The same thing I had watched happen to my father's face in those journal entries, the slow recalibration of someone who had been running a plan that has just come apart, the shift from confidence to confusion to something much smaller and quieter. He looked at me. I did not look away. I did not smile or react or perform any kind of victory. I just met his eyes and waited, the way you wait when you have built a case correctly and you know what the outcome will be, and there is nothing left to prove except the last few minutes of the process. When court resumed, Christine Poole stood and said that the petitioner wished to withdraw the challenge to the will. Judge Calloway shook his head. He said that given the nature of the evidence presented, he was not inclined to simply close the matter. He said the characterizations made about the respondent in the original petition were not supported by the record and appeared to have relied on selectively assembled and misleading documentation. He said he was entering a finding of no basis for the petition, with prejudice, meaning Derek could not refile. He also said he was referring the matter to the court's oversight committee to review whether the filings had met the standards of good faith required for probate challenges. He looked at the petitioner's table for a long moment. Then he looked at me and said, "The will stood in its entirety." He said the estate was released to the named beneficiary with the court's confirmation of its validity. We were done in just under 2 hours. There was no dramatic scene, no confrontation in the hallway, no final words. Derek and Rochelle left quickly, Christine Poole behind them with her briefcase and the expression of a professional who had been handed a case that was not what it appeared to be. I stood outside the courtroom with Sandra and James and Dana, and James put his arm around me and did not say anything, which was exactly right. Sandra said we would wait and see what the committee review produced. She said Derek had taken a risk with that petition, and the court did not typically look kindly on proceedings that misrepresented a respondent's background the way this one had. I told her to do whatever she thought was right. What happened after that took several months to fully resolve. The Oversight Committee found that the petition had contained materially misleading characterizations of the respondent and referred the matter to the State Bar for review of Christine Poole's conduct. I do not know the outcome of that process, and it was not my concern. Derek called me 6 weeks after the hearing. I did not answer. He left a voicemail that was 4 minutes long. I listened to it once. It was the kind of message where someone apologizes for getting caught rather than for what they did, where the words are right but the weight behind them is wrong. Sandra listened to it and said the same thing. I did not call back. My father's house is still standing in Bloomington. I go there on weekends when I need quiet. I sit in his kitchen with the crossword he will never finish and a cup of coffee, and I let the house be what it is. 31 years of a careful and decent man who kept composition notebooks and made exceptional chili and loved his daughters, both of them, even the one he never figured out how to stay close to. I kept the green notebook. I do not read it anymore. That part is finished. But I keep it on my bookshelf between 2 books he gave me, and sometimes I put my hand on the cover and think about what it cost him to write those last 3 paragraphs. He was not a man who said things easily or often. He showed up. He paid attention. He kept records. He left me everything I needed. Not just in the will. James and I got engaged in December. He proposed on a Sunday morning, which is when my father always called, and I do not think that was an accident. We were at the kitchen table with coffee and the crossword that neither of us can finish without cheating, and he slid a small box across the table without any ceremony, which is entirely consistent with who he is and why I love him. I said yes. Marcus, my father's morning aide, sent me a card when I wrote to thank him for his willingness to give a statement. He said my father had talked about me often during those morning shifts. He said Gerald had described me once as the kind of person who figures things out. He said he had told Marcus that he always knew I would be fine, whatever happened, because I understood something that most people never learn. That the numbers tell the truth when people won't. I have been back in that courthouse 4 times since February. Different cases, different courtrooms, different attorneys on the other side. The work is the same. Find the pattern, verify the facts. Present the evidence clearly and let it stand on its own. I do not need drama. I do not need performance. I need a clean record and a well-built file and the patience to let the truth find its own level. My brother thought he could take what my father had spent a lifetime earning, and he thought he could do it by making me small, by reaching back into the hardest year of my life and turning it into a reason I should not be trusted. He thought that because I had fallen once, and because I had put myself back together quietly without making a spectacle of it, no one would be paying attention. He forgot that the quiet ones are usually the ones who know how to read. He forgot that I had spent 6 years building a career on the specific skill of finding what people try to hide. He forgot that my father, even sick and tired and watching his own hands shake, had been careful. He forgot that we do not forget how we were raised. If you stayed with me until the end of this, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, it means everything. If this story moved you or made you feel seen, please subscribe to Her Hidden Soul and leave me a comment telling me where you are and what you are holding on to right now. I read every single one, and there is another story waiting for you on your screen right now.